There's a very well-known theologian. He's a fabulous speaker. He died about 5 years ago. Incredible speaker, incredible professor, has written biblical commentaries, just has had a life that touched literally millions of people in profound ways. But he wasn't always that way. When he was growing up, he grew up in a fairly liberal church, but they still had catechism. They had confirmation. They wanted him to go through that. So he took the 3-month catechism class. Then he and his class of about 30 other people that were young people his age had to be interviewed by the elders in front of the whole church. And they quizzed him. They asked him about his conversion experience, about his relationship with Jesus. They asked him questions about church history, things he'd studied about the Bible. And he passed the test. Now he's been through catechism. He has been confirmed by the church, and he's allowed to take his first communion. He's a teenage boy. He takes his first communion. After it's over, he congregates in the back of the church in the foyer with some of his good buddies. He's talking with these good buddies. One of them said, "Well, what do you think about your first communion?" And he smiled and he thought about it. And the wafers were paper thin. And it was probably some cheap wine they had used. He said, "It tasted a lot like fish food to me." And they all laughed. One of the ladies in the church heard him talk about Holy Communion as fish food. And she just jumped all over him. "What do you mean? How can you say something like that about Holy Communion?" He's a kid. He's young. He's immature. He just didn't get it. He kept up with most of those 30 people that he had been through catechism and confirmation with, First Holy Communion, and tracking them for 30, 40, and 50 years. He said, as far as he knew, only 2 of them, besides himself, were still professing Christians. Doesn't matter if you go to church, doesn't matter if you do the stuff in church. It comes down to, do you have a relationship with God? We continue to study Romans today. We're going to be in the 2nd chapter. We're going to be looking at verses 11 through 29. And Paul is dealing with 2 groups of people. He's got Jewish people that have grown up with the Torah. They've grown up with the 10 Commandments. They grew up with Moses. They know all about that stuff, but they're not practicing. He's got pagans out of the Greek culture that have come in from orgies and worshiping all kinds of different idols, and they're doing a little bit better than these Jewish people. So he's dealing with all of these people that have different needs, different perspectives, different understandings of all this stuff. And he's just trying to help them along. Now, I've got some good news and some bad news for you today. I like to start with the bad news, so we'll end on a happy tone. We're going to be talking about today 3 things through the scriptures. As we look at these 3 things in the scriptures, we're going to be talking about judgment. Aren't you excited about that? Gets better. Then we're going to move to hypocrisy. And then we're going to end up with circumcision. Aren't you glad you stopped what you were doing to come here today? But here's the good news. It starts out with God does not show partiality to anybody. He is no respecter of persons. He is totally 100% just. So it's going to be a fair game. The other side of that at the end is you can receive the praise of God. So we turn to the scriptures, Romans chapter 2, picking up in verse 11. For God shows no partiality. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. Got to stop here for a minute. That sounds a whole lot like the words of James in the 1st chapter. So we flip to James verse 22. It says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Pretty simple stuff. When we look at this, if you do what God tells you to do, you will be blessed. If you don't do what he tells you to do, you're going to be deceived. You're going to believe the lies of Satan. Now, keep in mind who our enemy is. John 10:10 just kind of sums up everything. The thief comes only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. But I, Jesus, have come that you might have life to the fullest, that you might have life abundantly. So you've got a positive, good, creative force. You've got a negative, evil, destructive force. Which one will you go with? If we use the words of Paul in Romans, he says, are you going to serve? Are you going to worship? Are you going to follow the created things or the creator? We have to make that decision every day. In the first chapter, he talked about how God has given us the righteousness of God, and he talks about the wrath of God. The reason we talk about judgment is because there will be a judgment. I hope to clarify some things today. Sometimes people think, okay, if I have a relationship with Jesus, how am I going to be judged? I thought I was going to die and go to heaven and everything would be fine. Well, you're saved. That would be salvation by faith. It's your works that will be judged, and will bring some clarity to that. So you can be saved, but your works are still going to be judged, and you'll either be rewarded or not rewarded. So we keep reading in chapter 2 of Romans, verse 14, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. On that day, when according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. So God judges us by Jesus Christ. Jesus is the standard. God does not grade on a curve. I remember in college one time, I made about a 30 on a test. It was a new professor. The professor said, hey, I'm going to grade this on the curve, so don't panic when I pass your papers back. I got a 30. I thought, oh my gosh, that's got to be an F. Then he went to the board and started drawing the bell curve. My 30 was a B. I did good on it. It was, some people were in the single digits. The test was way too hard for our level of understanding at the time, but we graded on the curve. God grades, and he basically says, are you perfect? If you're perfect, you're acceptable to me. Well, we can't do that on our own. We already blew it. So that's why Jesus came, to give us his perfect righteousness. And we get to choose, do we want to go with the righteousness with God or the wrath of God? When we don't choose to live righteously, the wrath cometh. The wrath is a result of sin. Sin always separates us from God, the most important people in our lives, and the most important things in our lives. That's what sin does. So we get to pick and choose. We're going to do it God's way or the devil's way. God came that we'd have life abundantly. Satan came to steal, to kill, and to destroy. That's what you're choosing between. Now, Satan is good at marketing. He really is. He's a good salesman, but he always brings bad values. That means it's going to cost you more than you want to pay. It's going to hold you longer than you want to stay. And it's going to be tough to get out of its way. God offers you good values. You always get much more than you pay for, really, because he's already paid for it for you. So that's a very, very good thing. We look at this judgment that's coming, and I want us to look at two passages of scripture. One of them is in Luke chapter 18. We see two very different kinds of people here, and Jesus gives the contrast. In chapter 18, verse 9, Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. So, what you're dealing with there, Jesus is talking about a Pharisee. This guy knew the Bible forwards and backwards, but he was haughty, he was arrogant, he was proud, he was exalting himself. He was even saying to God, thank you, God, that I'm not like him and him and him and him and him. Thank you that I'm not even like this guy, this worthless tax collector right here. God, I fast twice a week. I give alms. I do good things. I tithe. I'm such a good person. He was exalting himself. His prayer was not accepted. God does not grade on the curve. We can always find somebody who is worse than us to compare ourselves to. And we tend to do that. You know, he just finished talking in the last session about judgment. We always judge from our point of strength, not our weaknesses. We can always find somebody who we are better than them. And God's saying, hey, I don't care how you compare to other people. I'm not grading on the curve. But this tax collector he didn't even look up to heaven. He bowed his head, he beat his chest, he was sincere, he humbled himself. And he said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. He recognized he needed God. He compared himself vertically, and his prayer was accepted. The Pharisees and some of the Jewish people were trying to look at everybody else and saying, we're better, we're better, we're better. And God said, that's still not good enough. And stop comparing yourself to them. I learned this lesson so many times. I'm sure y'all have probably never, ever exalted yourself and been humbled. But one of my star performances was as a kid. I was born the day after Christmas. That is a lousy day for a birthday. My parents failed at good family planning, and I came along the day after Christmas. Actually, I was expected on Thanksgiving, and I came the day after Christmas. I was late. I was born crippled. Literally, one foot was turned in 45 degrees, another 90 degrees, because I shouldn't fit in the womb anymore. My mama was tired when she finally pushed me out. It was rough coming into this world. The doctor poked me in the eye, so I was born with a black eye, and he skinned my head with the forceps. It was just a tough time. It's been tough ever since. I could do a Rodney Dangerfield for you right now, but because I had a Christmas day after Christmas birthday, and what kid wants to leave his own brand new toys and come to your birthday party and eat, your birthday cake and celebrate your gifts? So mom, in her best efforts to be redemptive, would have summertime parties. So we went to Sandy Lake. Most of you probably know about Sandy Lake in Carrollton. A big, huge swimming pool. They used to have this tower. It was massive. It went beyond the galaxy. Just a small child who was this tall. Yeah, I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old. Got all my buddies out there. We're having a birthday party. I climb up on this tower. I think it was maybe 20-foot tall diving tower. And I'm standing up there. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. Now, I was styling that day. We were kind of poor. And I needed a new bathing suit because that was in those growth years. I'd outgrown last year's. And Mom said, let me make you one. Let's go to the fabric store and you can pick out some fabric. I picked out some leopard skin fabric. It was terry cloth. Hey, I've always set fashion standards. So I've got my terry cloth, and I wanted surfer stripes, two little stripes on one leg, really ultra cool. So I'm high fashion up in front, yelling, Mom, Dad, all my friends, look at me, look at me. When they're all looking, I dive into the water. I didn't jump, I dived. I dived in, that bathing suit hit that water, it stayed on the surface. I came up about 12 feet away, but naked. And you talk about getting some attention. All my friends went on about that for years to come. I was truly, profoundly humbled because I tried to exalt myself. And then in much more sophisticated ways, when I spent 20 years in mega churches, I was constantly trying to exalt myself, prove my worth, prove my value, get more and more kind of like the Pharisee in the temple saying, hey, 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 I'm better than these people. I'm better than, I deserve this. I deserve this. I deserve, and here's why. Didn't work. When we back off and we recognize that we are just sinful beings and receive God's mercy, then he will lift us up. So we look at this situation. There's a judgment coming. The other passage I want to look at is in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that makes the judgment real clear. I love this passage, verse 10. Paul says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation other than which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest. For the day will disclose it because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. Now, we've used the word work twice now already. Work, work. If the third time, work, that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work, fourth time, is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. Obviously, Paul's speaking metaphorically. You can build your life on the foundation of Christ with gold and silver and precious jewels, things of great value. You can do it with wood, with hay, with straw. Those things are going to be destroyed by the fire. So when you do things that are going to last, and I've heard all of my life, it's probably true, the only things that last forever would be the souls of men and the word of God. When you build things on that foundation with things of value, I don't know that God values anything more than people. When you invest in people, when you love people, when you help people, whatever you've done unto the least of these, you've done unto me, says Jesus. So that's what's going to last. That's the gold, that's the silver, that's the precious stones that's going to last you. So there will be a judgment. You're saved by faith, but you're going to be judged by your works. And if any of those last, you're going to be rewarded forever and ever and ever. Think about the long-term plan. So we go back to 1 Corinthians, to Romans chapter 2. We pick up in verse 17. He said, before we go there, let me tell you about a friend. Sherry and I had a friend, we called him Wild Bill. Wild Bill kind of knew about the judgment. Sherry met him. She was doing a shoot for AFI. She was part of that years ago. They were meeting in Dallas, and it was kind of like a big conference. They were watching a lot of different movies at the Magnolia Theater. between shoots, she was doing some red carpet stuff for people. When she wasn't shooting with her camera, she's sitting out there going through, looking at pictures and stuff. And there was this old guy out there, and they got to talking. That's the guy we labeled Wild Bill. I don't remember his last name. But they had a delightful conversation. He'd been in the film industry for 40 years. He lived in Dallas the whole time. He flew to LA every Monday morning and flew back every Friday afternoon. He was one of 28 people that back in the 80s, American Airlines was in the tank. They were having a lot of financial trouble. They needed cash. Interest rates were sky high, 12, 13, 14% back then. They couldn't pay that kind of interest, but they needed money. Robert Crandall had just become president of American Airlines. And he had this idea, we're going to go to our best, most frequent flyers and see if they will help us raise money. So he came out with Air Pass, which is American Airlines Air Pass. For $250,000, you could have unlimited first class flights for the rest of your life for a flat fee of $250,000. For another $150,000, you can get a buddy pass and take anybody anywhere with you that American flew anytime. That is still in effect. There were 3 people that they got rid of along the way because you might say they were a little bit abusive of the program. They still broke their contract with those people, but they found out one guy, if he wasn't flying with a buddy of his, he'd just go up and find somebody who was flying and say, hey, you want to fly for free in first class today? And they'd usually say, yeah. And he'd say, come on, it's your lucky day. Boom, into that. So he was abusing the program. They cost American Airlines over $1 million a year because they would fly to Canada for lunch, fly to France to have lunch with a friend, fly to London to see another friend. Some people really abused it, but he was one of those guys. He flew so much. He said, used to, when he'd be in LA, if he got in a traffic jam, he'd just call American, say, can I talk to the pilot of flight so-and-so? This is Wild Bill. And they put him through the pilot and say, hey, this is Bill. We're running about probably 10, 15 minutes out. Can you hold the plane for me? He said, sure, Bill, come on. They loved him. He was that kind of guy. But Bill told Sherry about when he died. Well, that really got my attention. And I said, I want to meet this guy. So we took him to lunch one day at Angelo's. It's over in Lakewood, not too far away. We spent about 2 or 3 hours together. Fascinating guy. He died in a hospital, was pronounced dead. And he said he found himself in this tunnel. And he was walking through this tunnel. One side of the tunnel, he was like kind of watching a movie. It was just, he saw his life at all different stages of all the good things he did. And as he's walking down this same tunnel, on the other side were all the not so good things that he did. And he's just walking along, he's looking at this. He gets to the end of the tunnel and God says, how'd you do? When God asks you a question, I don't think we're even capable of lying to God in places like that. He said, well, I did okay with some things, but I really messed up some other ones. And he said, I sure wish I could fix some of them. I sure would like another chance. And God said, okay. So he came back. Bill died over the course of a few more years, 2 more times, had that same experience each time. Walking down this tunnel, good things on one side, bad things on the other. And the judgment for him was, how'd you do? He got to judge himself. When we look at this passage, early and later in the passage, it talks about our heart and our conscience. God gave everybody a conscience. Everybody knows the difference between right and wrong. In the first part of this passage, the Jewish people who knew the law forward and backwards, inside out, left to right, right to left, they knew it well. God gave them a conscience. These Greek pagans that had recently come to Christ, who had been living in orgies and worshiping all kinds of different gods, they somehow, without knowing the law, still knew the difference between right and wrong because God built it into us. You are a spirit, you have a soul, and you live in a body. the function of your spirit, and sometimes you can use heart and spirit interchangeably. I think probably the best definition of heart is the totality of your being, which would be the heart muscle in your body, the physical, and your soul to the depths of your spirit. But the three functions of your spirit is it is your communion with God. That's how you connect with God, through your spirit. Jesus said to the woman at the well, God is seeking worshipers to worship him in spirit and in truth. So we connect with God through our spirit. It's your communion with God. It's also your conscience. And it's your intuition. Intuition is when you know things that do not come to you through your five senses. So your conscience and your intuition will kind of nudge you and let you know this is not right. Shouldn't do this. Not a good thing. There have been so many times I have willfully done the wrong thing. My conscience was screaming at me, not a good idea, but my soul, my mind, my will, and my emotions would rationalize it. I'd go ahead and do it. Knew I was wrong the whole time. So we can avoid that. I think God's probably going to ask us one of these days, how'd you do? And you will tell him the truth. So let your conscience, let your heart be your job. It's going to help you better in the judgment, and it's going to help you avoid hypocrisy, which we're going to read about now. Verse 17. But if you call yourself a Jew, that word if was probably incendiary when he said that to these Jewish people. If you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For it's written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So Paul is jumping on hypocrisy. He points out to them what a good person would look like, what a good person would do. I was looking at this. Paul had not yet learned about run-on sentences. It's several verses or one long sentence, but he's really on a roll and doesn't want to take a breath. And then he comes to the specifics. You say one must not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Well, Jesus had changed things a lot. Moses gave them the law, said, don't commit adultery. Jesus comes along in the Beatitudes and said, you have heard that it said, don't commit adultery. But I say to you, if you commit it in your heart, if you lust after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. God is about your heart. It's a mistake I made for over 40 years of my life. I kept trying to look good on the outside, didn't really care what was in my heart as long as I performed well. God is looking at the heart. When Israel was looking for a king, the scripture says, man looks on the outward appearance, God looks at the heart. Constantly working on my heart to be more loving, more kind, more understanding, more forgiving, less judgmental. That's heart stuff. The Jewish people he was writing to were pretty squeaky clean. They very seldom ever got caught in adultery. It talks about, do you teach against idolatry and yet you rob temples? Sometimes those Jewish people in those days, even though they were against idolatry, they would still steal the idols from temples and sell them for a profit to people who worship such idols. So he's on to them. And he's saying, hey, you got to get rid of this hypocrisy. It's a bad thing. When you are authentic, when you're genuine, people will believe you, people will trust you, and you might make them a little bit uncomfortable. Years ago, I was in a men's group, and one of the guys who was a good friend, played lots of sports together, had a lot of good times together. His wife was on staff at a big church I worked for. Great guy. Everybody loved him. And he said in this men's group one day, he said, I look at my children, my precious little girls, and I say, do you know how much daddy loves you? And they look at me and they say, really? He said, I wish that they believed me so much that they would never question what I say. As time rolled on, we realized he was having multiple affairs. And I really liked all the women he had affairs with, but he was he was married to a wonderful woman, and he got himself in a whole lot of trouble. And then we understood why his children, who were too young to understand any of that, just didn't trust him. They could feel it. It was in their intuition. Something's not right here. There was a Christian man who participated in the Professional Golfers Association. He'd been on the PGA Tour, and he'd become pretty good friends with the guy that was Golfer of the Year that year for the PGA. When you're Golfer of the Year, one of the awards you have is you get to play golf around a day of golf with the President of the United States of America and Billy Graham and Jack Nicklaus. So the four of them played golf. Well, the Christian who knew this guy that was not a believer was eager to see how it went when he spent the day with those three very significant people. And he was at the golf course, he'd been practicing some, and he saw them coming in. As soon as they finish, they get back to the shop. He sees his friend, shakes hands with all of them. He's red in the face. He walks away angrily and heads straight for the driving range. And he pulls out his drivers and he just starts pounding balls. He's hitting balls. He's just driving, trying to burn off something. But I mean, just discharging a whole lot, just pounding those balls. He finally let up for a minute, wiped his forehead off. And the friend who was sitting near him watching this said, hey, how'd it go today? And he said, I really didn't need Billy Graham shoving religion down my throat all day long, and started pounding balls again. Go whop, go whop, go whop. He finally wound down a little bit more, and the friend said, hey, did Billy Graham really put it to you today? And the guy said, honestly, he didn't say a single word about religion. He's a heck of a nice guy. I just had a bad day. That man probably had no idea why he had a bad day. He'd been in the presence of an incredibly godly person. And when you're around people like that, it feels bad when you're not right with God. People like that, like Jesus, stir up the demons. You remember the demons got all bent out of shape. They were having a great time with Legion, but when Jesus showed up, they freaked out. And when the Spirit of the Lord is bigger and bigger in you, it will make people uncomfortable. But people know the difference. They just know the difference between the real deal and phonies. And Paul's encouraging us to practice what we preach. He said, these things you teach, do you teach yourself? I have a philosophy of life. I think it's true. And I think if you embrace it, you'll learn a whole lot. People teach what they need to learn. When you look at Jimmy Swaggart, when he was at the pinnacle, the highest level of immorality, going to hotels and meeting with hookers there, that's when he was doing his hardest preaching and teaching against sexual immorality. Of course, when I share that with you, I indict myself, the kind of things I deal with people all day long, 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 days a week sometimes, is the issues of life. And I thank God for it. I need me more than my clients need me. And some of them would disagree with that. It's true, though. It really is true. I need to teach what I'm teaching because I need to be reminded of it every single day of my life. I'm a contraphobic 6 on the Enneagram, which would mean my lot in life is to overcome fear. I'm a very, very melancholic temperament, have a strong propensity toward depression, and I need to remind myself and remember several days a week what I teach people because it helps me. The only reason I do it is because it worked for me. Come a long way. I've overcome the fear and the depression, but sin crouches at the door. It's waiting to jump on me anytime I drop my guard. So that's why I say I really believe we teach what we need to learn. If you really listen to people and you hear the things that they're pretty strong about, pay attention. That may be something they're in the process of learning. The third thing we talk about today is circumcision. I know y'all have been eager to hear Bible study on that. I usually cringe, but I'm just going to blast through this one because it is truly very significant. Verse 25, for circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. So let's try to understand this strange kind of teaching. We go back to Genesis chapter 15. That is way back there. Now, Paul in Romans is talking about you are saved, you are justified, you're made righteous by faith. It starts here. In chapter 15, verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Abraham is justified by faith. And then he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur the Chaldeans to give you the land to possess. But he said, Oh Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 year old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought these all, and he cut them in half and laid each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. That makes very little sense to us unless you understand how Abraham would understand it. Back in those days, if people made a covenant, they would take actions. Like they might pick up a handful of dirt and sprinkle it all over themselves and say, if I don't keep this covenant, may I be like this dust and return to the dust of the earth. May I die and be buried if I don't keep my covenant. That was how they really got serious about it. Here, God is saying, hey, we're going to have a blood sacrifice, cut all these animals in two and lay them out. And what God was about to take Abraham through was what would happen to God if he did not keep his covenant. And it was getting dark, it was getting late, and God caused a deep sleep to come over Abraham. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. This was prophetic. This came to pass. The children of Israel spent the next 400 years in Egypt until God judged those who afflicted them and swallowed them, the Egyptians, up in the Red Sea. So God tells him in this dream what's about to come. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring, I give this land. From the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and the land of all these different people. It was a huge, massive, gigantic promise. And basically, what God was saying, if I don't keep this, let me be like these animals that have been cut in two and burned up by the fire passing between them. That's God's part. Then we jump over to Genesis 17. In 17, verse 10, it says, this is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Circumcision literally means a cutting around. Keep that picture in mind. It's a cutting around. God is setting these people aside. He's saying you're going to be different from everybody else on the planet. This is going to be the outward sign of it because of our covenant. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generation, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. He just goes on and on for another whole paragraph here. And Dr. R.C. Sproul was preaching one day, and he was teaching on this passage. And he read this passage, and somebody in the crowd said, primitive and obscene. And he said, excuse me, what did you say? And they stood up and they said, primitive and obscene. The only reason he asked for him to say it a second time, he was trying to figure out, what am I going to do with somebody who shouts at me from the crowd? As he had a few seconds to think, he said, thank you. I love the word you chose, obscene. There's nothing more obscene than this, because this foreshadows what was going to happen to Jesus. Jesus became circumcision for us. He was cut around. He was cut off from the land of the living. He was separated from God. He took sin upon himself so that he could offer you this spiritual circumcision as the new covenant. See, this is the covenant. This is the old covenant. Abraham and God had a blood covenant. With Jesus in the new covenant, we also have a blood covenant, and we have spiritual circumcision. It's a setting apart. God has called you to be different. He's called us to circumcise our hearts, our lips, and our ears. He's called us to be different. You know, when I was a kid, things were just different. I remember when the movie came out. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. It was Scarlett O'Hara. What was the name? Gone with the Wind. I was a kid then. It was shocking because somebody actually on the big screen used the word damn once. Shocked us. That was the beginning of a huge change. Today, you can flip on just about any television channel and find every kind of obscenity and profanity possible on it. Back in those days, nudity was not acceptable. It's acceptable today. Our culture has changed, and yet God has circumcised our hearts. He's called us to be a different kind of people, to follow him, to obey his law, not only to look good on the outside, but to have our hearts cleaned up for him. I'll wrap it up with this today. It ends in this passage in Romans, saying his praise is not from man, but from God. If you want to be praised by God, understand the judgment and do works that will last through the fire of the judgment. If you want to be praised by God, get rid of the hypocrisy in your life. And if you want to be praised by God, live like a person whose heart has been cut around, who's been set apart, who's been differentiated from the rest of the population. Somebody who modeled this well, somebody who was praised by God, was Dr. Kermit Whitaker. When I was a junior high school boy at Cliff Temple Baptist Church, he came to be our minister of education. And even though I was a junior high school boy, he still befriended me, which was no easy task. And he mentored me for many years to come. 3 of the churches I served, I went there because he recommended me. He had that much influence. He was a godly man. He spent the first 40 years of his life in student work. He didn't get married until his mid-50s because he was so all about ministry. But when he married Betty Whitaker. He put her through dental school. She grew up to have the biggest periodontal practice in Oak Cliff. He went from student work until he was about 40 to Cliff Temple Baptist Church, where I met him. Then he went to First Baptist Church of Longview. Then he went to Wilshire Baptist Church. Then he went to the Annuity Board to be a vice president with Daryl Morgan. Then he went to Dallas Baptist University to be a vice president with Gary Cook. And then he finally retired in his early 70s. Mr. Roy Eastus gave him the biggest real estate agency in all of Oak Cliff, where he made another fortune to go on top of his wife's fortune. So he was incredibly blessed financially, never really cared about money that much except how he could give it away. If you go to Dallas Baptist University or several other Christian campuses of universities and seminaries, you'll find bronze monuments committed to him. He's been honored. He has been praised by God because he knew there'd be a judgment coming. He's a wealthy, wealthy, wealthy man in heaven today. He got rid of the hypocrisy and he lived with a circumcised heart. You'll be blessed as you do this.